Hello, I'm Isabelle Finn-Kelcey. I'm a teacher and I'd like to tell you about a case study I did on the double empathy problem that was looking at valuing of autistic students' creative writing. Just a note on positionality and values. I'm neurotypical. I teach English to autistic and other neurodivergent students. I find the curriculum for English overly neuronormative, and I think that this risks jeopardizing autistic students' sort of healthy development. The study came about because I was working in an access centre for autistic students and that joined a main school. And I found when I was working alongside mainstream colleagues, conducting marking and moderating activities relating to the students' creative writing, that my students' work tended to be sort of sitting at the bottom of the kind of grade range for age-related expectations. And I wanted to look into why this was the case when I felt that their work was really good. And a few years ago, when I was studying for my M.Ed, I heard Damien Milton lecture on the double empathy problem. So this was very much in my thoughts, and I wondered if perhaps the, if you like, the social encounter between an autistic student and a non-autistic, mostly non-autistic teacher or assessor through the medium of that student's creative script was a kind of a real life scenario of the double empathy problem as conceived by Damien Milton, in which you have two communicators, if you like, one autistic and one non-autistic, and they have to kind of communicate across their neurotypes. So neither has an instinctive alignment with the other. Both experience glitches, but maybe the low marks that my students were receiving, perhaps that's the equivalent of being othered by the neurotypical communication partner. My study took place across 2 academic years. Recently, I had 11 autistic participants from the Access Centre, and they were all boys, all aged between 11 and 16. And I was able to use the school's databases to find a cognitive match for each of those participants in the main school. So a non-autistic cognitive match based on the cognitive ability test data that the school keeps on all its students. I sought and obtained all my permissions, and each student donated 1 or more creative scripts, and I ended up with 17 pairs of narratives. So my colleagues and I marked these according to the AQA mark scheme. And they were actually, there was some really extensive moderating going on too that involved other schools at the time, just to do with the way our English department was running at the time. And the AQA is the dominant exam board provider of English language GCSE examinations. And the GCSE is the dominant form of summative assessment when children are aged 15 or 16. What we found was that in of these 17 pairs of scripts, in 15 cases, it was the non-autistic student who scored higher. Now, looking at the mark scheme, which is a document, no one can, there's no such thing as a neutral document in this context. What you notice is there's the requirement on every tier of marks, every band of marks, that the candidate matches, the content matches audience. However, it's not specified in what way must this match, what aspects of the audience must it match. So you're sort of left to infer, is this notions of relevance? Is it to do with the cognitive needs of the audience? Or is it something to do with tastes or sensibilities? This is not outlined by the AQA. And this also led me to wonder, is this notional reader who is the audience at every tier, are they supposed to be neurotypical? Again, that's not stated. I wanted to design a rival assessment scheme because I regarded the AQA scheme as very narrow. So I wanted to look at broad merit with a view to catching merit where it's otherwise sort of going unrecognised. And so merit in English, in English creative writing. So I wanted to measure something to do with structure, essentially with language, and something to do with content, sort of theme or something. The AQA in one of their examiners' reports recently for English, the English language creative writing question, they said they were valuing the scripts which made reference to the human condition. So now obviously the human condition, it's a very social concern. It's to do with being a human among other humans. So I wanted to design some kind of measure of the way this is being referenced in the students' creative writing. To measure structure, I quite simply sort of blocked out all the narratives in terms of their sort of narrative phases from exposition through to resolution, to see how they're proportioned. Were they controlled? Were they phased sequentially? All of these things. And anyway, they were similarly proportioned. So autistic or non-autistic authored, there wasn't a great difference in those phases. I was able to observe some further structural features. One of those was that the autistic students made much more use of dialogue and other reported speech, using speech marks. Also, that a few of the autistic students used really, you might say, imaginative narrative voices, such as female voices or adult voices, whereas only one of the neurotypical students did this. Similarly, when I was analysing the language that the students were using to convey these imagined realities, I found that essentially they were equally plausible and detailed in their use of language. But however, there were some differences in how the language was used, but equally effective. So the non-autistic students tended to make more use of single instances of figurative language, such as onomatopoeia or personification, things that you can kind of spot, they're obvious. The older autistic students used figurative language differently. There was more symbolism. There was more symbolism that was written in literal language. So symbolism that you might miss unless you really reflected on the kind of the whole text meaning. And there was symbolism that operated at a whole text level. So for example, Ben, who's in year 11 at the time, so GCSE year, he bookended one of his narratives. At the beginning, the atypical protagonist descends hard concrete stairs. Then there's an episode in a kind of gangster's den of unsympathetic types. And then the atypical protagonist ascends the stairs at the end. The hard concrete stairs, that's just a literal description, but the whole episode is sort of symbolic, or you can read it as being symbolic of a kind of autistic experience of sort of navigating a neurotypical setting full of danger and so on. And also another feature of language is that the older autistic students use much more humour, and sometimes this was deadpan, parodic humour. And for example, Matthew, who's also in his GCSE year, I've changed all the names, by the way, he commented really emphatically about on his protagonist's degenerative neural disease, which is it's a parodic reference to the medical model of autism that he just flung out there for our amusement. And you can see this use of humour. Humour is a demonstration of affect. So Matthew's really throwing the reader a line to engage with in the use of his humorous phrase there. So to measure sort of social or psychological depth in reference to the human condition, I had a real think about what is fiction for? What's the theory of what we're doing with our narratives as humans. And Sunshine says if you look at, you know, computer games, movies, novels, it's all fiction, it's all narrative. Sunshine says that this gives the reader the opportunity to kind of step inside someone else's thought processes, someone else's, you know, attitudes or opinions, that kind of thing. And this reminded me of Dennett's orders of intentionality, and I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. In Pride and Prejudice, there's one point when Elizabeth Bennet blushes, and when Jane Austen describes that blush, she's engaging in fifth order intentionality, because there are sort of 5 levels of minds kind of brought together. So because Austen wants the reader to understand that Elizabeth is aware that her family's intentions and mental processes, if you like, fall short of group expectations. So in the description of that blush, Austen's bringing together all those minds, you know, across the centuries. We've got the reader's mind in there, we've got Austen's mind, Elizabeth's neighbours' minds, her family's minds were all brought together in this really satisfying, socially dense episode. So when I used this measure, you can just go and count the minds that are nested together in all of the scripts, and I did that. And interestingly, it was the autistic students who were producing these greater levels of intentionality in their texts. So on average, the autistic students were kind of half a level to a level higher than the non-autistic students. This was all, it's fairly even across the age range. In fact, 6 autistic students and 2 non-autistic students equaled that fifth order that I just outlined. For example, Jack, who's in year 10, he had a really parallel moment in his script. Lee held back a smirk. That's really a nice parallel to the blush. So we have Jack wants the reader to understand that Lee does not wish his captain to realise that Lee believes that he's being a bit silly. And I particularly find that interesting because what Jack is talking about is a non-smirk as opposed to the blush, so the withholding of the smirk. Jack doesn't speak. So this is particularly sort of densely interesting and effective on Jack's part. And we have to remember that high orders of intentionality are very sort of cognitively expensive. It's like you're spinning many social plates there. And in fact, some anthropologists think that with fifth order, you're kind of topping out with what a human can do. So you can really, that really puts it into context. You can see that these students who are engaging in these high orders, and some of them went beyond, we had some sixth orders in there too. It's really pitching this social content towards the reader. So you can see it as an engagement tool, reaching across this reader-writer divide. So in conclusion, well, I was considering whether we can say the double empathy problem is at work currently in the way autistic students' creative writing is or isn't valued in our educational assessment system. And I think by these measures, it looks as if, yes, we do have a double empathy problem at work here. And we can describe that by saying that you can demonstrate how hard the students are working to bridge that gap. You can see the tools at work, the expense, the effort that's going in cognitively, the sophistication of the ways and means. However, it's not rewarded because in almost all cases, it's the non-autistic peer who picks up the better marks. We can say that the other way around by saying that the non-autistic students appear to enjoy an advantageous relationship with the assessor in the way that the schemes are currently written and used. The thing that really stands out to me about this is while the autistic students or any candidate, they're obliged to match audience, there's no sort of reciprocal mechanism in any of this system to ensure that the reader has to also, be prepared to pick up on some of this content. So it's imbalance. We have reaching across on one side and a kind of not picking it up on the other, which I think that's a structural flaw in our current system. And it disproportionately impacts on the autistic students. Of course, the risk is that we stifle the adolescent autistic voice, because as teachers then we'll be looking for ways that they can make, they can securely get their marks, and that's going to be more to do with, telling them about spelling rules or so on, that is not directly to do with their personal healthy psychological development. Anyway, I think this area just needs more research and much more steer from autistic researchers and educationalists. Thank you.